She thought she owned every person in that house, and for a while, she was right. Somewhere behind the locked door of a bedroom in a London townhouse, 3 different men touched the same woman. Only one of them ever paid for it. There was a footman in the Duchess's household named Thomas. He was young, careful, and quiet in the specific way that servants in great houses learn to be quiet. Not shy exactly, but trained. Footmen were chosen in part for their appearance. Tall, symmetrical, well-turned-out men were considered a kind of decoration for a wealthy household, meant to be seen standing at attention in the hall or trailing a carriage, silent and immaculate. But being decorative came with a danger nobody talked about openly. A handsome footman in a house run by a bored, powerful woman was walking through a minefield every single day, and he knew it. Looking too long at the wrong person, in the wrong hallway, at the wrong hour, could end a career in an instant. Or, far worse, could start something a servant had absolutely no power to stop once it began. Thomas had come into service the way most footmen did, young, recommended by a family friend, or a rural clergyman, who vouched for his character, hired first as an underfootman in a smaller household, before working his way, through several years of good conduct, into a position in a house as prestigious as Ashworth's. It was, by the standards of his birth, an enormous achievement. Footmen in grand London households earned considerably more than most labouring men outside domestic service, received room, board, and livery provided by their employer, and stood at the very top of what a young man without land or education could realistically hope to achieve. Thomas understood, better than almost anyone else in that house, exactly how much he stood to lose, and exactly how replaceable he was. There were always more young men in the countryside, willing to trade a farm labourer's wages for a footman's livery and a warm bed in a London townhouse. He had learned, from his very first week in the position, to make himself useful, invisible, and utterly beyond reproach. One evening, in the east corridor of the townhouse, with the rest of the staff occupied elsewhere, and the hour late enough that the corridor had gone dim and hushed, the Duchess found Thomas alone and made her interest known, not with the crude directness later dramatizations sometimes assume. This was a woman who had spent her entire adult life being subtle, because subtlety was safer, and because subtlety let her deny everything later if she ever needed to. It was in her tone, in the way she didn't move out of his path, in the question she asked him, which sounded almost casual, and wasn't. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said, keeping his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, the way every footman was trained to hold himself in her presence. I don't believe that would be proper. It was, in its way, a small masterpiece of survival, a refusal dressed so carefully in the language of deference that no one overhearing it could have called it defiance. He didn't say no directly. He didn't need to. She understood him perfectly, and so did he understand, from the flicker that crossed her face before she recovered her composure, exactly how rare his answer was. Just like that, quietly, respectfully, because a servant who valued his position learned to make even a refusal sound like deference, but unmistakably, unambiguously, no. You have to understand how extraordinary that word was, coming from him, in that context. Nobody said no to the Duchess of Ashworth. Not the tradesmen who supplied the house and depended on her custom. Not the staff, who depended on her goodwill for their livelihoods. Not, most days, even her own husband, who had learned over the course of their marriage that peace was easier to maintain than principle. And here was a footman, a man who, in the strict legal and social hierarchy of the time, owned essentially nothing, who could be dismissed with a snap of her fingers and replaced by another tall, well-mannered young man within the week, looking her directly in the eye and refusing her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have him dismissed on the spot, which is what you might expect from the caricature of an aristocratic villain. That's what makes her genuinely dangerous, rather than simply cruel. She filed it away. She waited. And waiting, as you're about to see, was the single most effective weapon she had. Weeks passed. The household resumed its ordinary rhythm. the endless choreography of a great house, running on schedule, breakfast trays and morning calls, afternoon visits and evening dinners, the constant, exhausting maintenance of appearances that consumed nearly every waking hour of everyone who served inside it. Thomas allowed himself to believe the matter had quietly ended, that his refusal had simply been absorbed and forgotten, the way small frictions between servants and masters often were, because neither side wanted the disruption of pursuing them further. It was during these ordinary weeks that his attachment to Mary, the young kitchen maid, deepened into something neither of them had planned on, and both of them knew was forbidden. Mary had come to Ashworth House at 15, starting as a scullery maid, scrubbing pots in the lowest, hottest corner of the kitchen before working her way up, over several years of unglamorous labor, to her current position, preparing and plating dishes destined for the family's table upstairs. She was, by every account this story can offer, exactly the kind of steady, capable young woman a great house depended on, and rarely thanked adequately. The invisible labor beneath every elegant dinner the family and their guests ever enjoyed, without a second thought for who had made it possible. Household rules in houses of this size were explicit on the subject. Many housekeepers required unmarried female servants to sign agreements for swearing followers entirely, on the theory, not entirely unreasonable, from an employer's perspective, that romantic attachments distracted servants from 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour working days, and that any resulting pregnancy would force the immediate dismissal of the woman involved, with no equivalent consequence ever falling on the man. Thomas and Mary knew all of this. They pursued each other anyway, in the small stolen minutes, a servant's schedule occasionally allowed, a shared moment in the scullery passage after the family had gone up to bed, a few words exchanged while carrying linens between floors, the particular, quiet intimacy of two people who saw each other every day inside a house that gave them almost no privacy at all. Whatever else this story took from them, it never quite managed to take that. That belief, that the matter with the Duchess had ended, was his mistake. It's worth noting, as a piece of historical context, that this pattern, a person in power appearing to let an incident go, only to use it later, at a moment of maximum advantage, is something social historians studying servant testimony and diaries from this period have documented again and again. Servants who kept journals or later gave accounts of domestic service frequently described this exact dynamic, the powerlessness of never knowing whether an earlier incident had truly been forgotten or was simply waiting for the right moment to be used against you. The Duchess found her moment late one night, walking the corridor near the servants' hall for reasons she would never have admitted to out loud. Below-stairs romances were common in great houses, and also almost universally forbidden by household rules. Many housekeepers and butlers enforced strict codes against followers, meaning any romantic attachment among staff, on the theory that romantic entanglements distracted servants from their duties and occasionally led to pregnancies that would force a female servant's dismissal. So when the Duchess found the linen room door not quite latched and looked inside to see Thomas and a young kitchen maid named Mary together, clearly in a moment neither of them was supposed to be having, in a house that expressly forbade it, she had found something far more useful to her than simple anger. The linen room itself was one of the few genuinely private spaces available to servants in a house like this, a narrow, candle-lit room lined with shelves of pressed sheets and table linens, tucked away from the main servants' corridor, used during the day for the ordinary business of household maintenance, and after hours, occasionally borrowed for exactly the kind of stolen privacy Thomas and Mary had found there. It should have been safe. It was, by every reasonable expectation either of them had, the one place in the entire house where they might be left alone. She said nothing in that moment. She only stood in the doorway, a single candle in her hand, throwing long shadows down the narrow room, watching for a length of time that must have felt, to the two people inside it, like it stretched on far longer than it actually did. Long enough, silent enough, that both of them looked up and understood, with a cold drop in the stomach that anyone who has ever been caught somewhere they shouldn't be will recognize instantly, that she had seen everything, and that she now knew exactly what to do with it. The next morning, she summoned Thomas privately and laid out his choice with the same calm, unhurried tone she used for approving a menu. "I find I no longer require an answer from you tonight," she told him. "Only a decision. You will come to my chambers when I send for you, and this remains between us. Or I will call for the housekeeper this afternoon and describe, in detail, precisely what I witnessed in the linen room last night. I imagine you can guess which of you two would actually pay for it." He could come to her chambers, quietly, whenever she sent for him, or she would go to the housekeeper and describe precisely what she had witnessed in the linen room, and Mary, not Thomas, would bear the consequence. Mary would be dismissed, without a reference, without severance, without the one document that stood between a young woman and complete destitution. She was right, and both of them knew it. A footman caught in impropriety with a kitchen maid might, depending on the temperament of the household, survive with a stern warning. Men were, with grim consistency, held to a more forgiving standard than women in matters like this, across nearly every level of society. A kitchen maid caught in the same circumstance rarely survived it at all. It's worth pausing on what dismissal without a character actually meant for a woman like Mary in this period, because modern audiences sometimes underestimate the stakes. A servant dismissed with a poor reputation had almost no legitimate employment options left in respectable households. Domestic service was one of the only forms of employment widely available to working-class women at the time, and it required a documented history of good conduct to access. Without it, a woman's realistic options narrowed dramatically: casual, poorly paid labor if she was fortunate, dependence on a workhouse if she wasn't, or worse, being pushed toward the kind of precarious, socially unprotected existence that respectable Regency society publicly condemned and privately manufactured through exactly this sort of mechanism. The threat wasn't abstract. It was a threat to end Mary's entire future in the space of a single conversation with a housekeeper. Thomas considered refusing the Duchess a second time. Historical accounts of domestic service suggest that many servants, faced with exactly this kind of leverage, did try to resist at first, but the calculation rarely stayed in their favor for long. He thought about what refusal would cost, and who would actually pay that cost. Not him, her. The woman he loved, thrown into a world with no safety net and no second chances because of a choice he made on principle. He said yes. Mary, for her part, remained unaware for some time of the exact bargain that had been struck to protect her position. Thomas made a deliberate choice not to tell her, reasoning, in the way people trapped in impossible situations often reason, that the knowledge would only add her suffering to his own, without changing anything about the arrangement itself. It is one of the quieter tragedies buried inside this story that even the person Thomas sacrificed the most to protect was, for a long stretch of it, protected from knowing the true cost of that protection at all. When she did eventually learn the truth, considerably later, it did not change what either of them could do about it. By then the arrangement had become simply a fact of their lives, one more danger to be managed alongside all the others that came with working in a house like Ashworth's. For a while, and there is no way to describe this that makes it sound anything other than exactly as bleak as it was, the arrangement functioned the way the Duchess had designed it to function. She got what she wanted, on her own schedule, without consequence. Thomas kept his silence. Mary kept her position, unaware, for a time, of the exact price being paid to protect it. Nobody in that arrangement was happy. But for a while, at least on the surface, nobody's life had yet been destroyed. It's tempting, looking back at this kind of dynamic from a modern vantage point, to want a cleaner word for what was happening. Extortion, exploitation, use of financial leverage to compel compliance. Those words all apply, but it's worth understanding that the legal system of the time had almost no framework at all for addressing it. There was no concept of workplace harassment as we understand it today. A servant's relationship to their employer was governed almost entirely by contract law, dressed up as personal loyalty, and the imbalance of power built into that relationship was not just tolerated by the legal system, it was, in a very real sense, the entire foundation the domestic service industry rested on. The arrangement demanded a particular kind of discipline from Thomas that few people outside domestic service would ever fully understand. He had to serve at the family's table, stand attentive behind the Duke's chair during dinner, carry messages between husband and wife, and maintain, in front of the entire household, the exact same posture of respectful invisibility he had always shown, while carrying, underneath all of it, a secret that could destroy 2 lives the moment it surfaced. There were near misses. A housemaid once noticed Thomas leaving the family wing at an hour no footman had any legitimate reason to be there, and he spent the following week half certain his position was about to end anyway, on terms he had no control over at all. He rehearsed, during those long, anxious days, a dozen different explanations he might offer if questioned directly. A message to deliver, a task assigned by the housekeeper, anything plausible enough to survive scrutiny, and was spared only because the housemaid in question had troubles enough of her own to occupy her attention and never mentioned what she'd seen to anyone who mattered. That was the precariousness of the entire arrangement. Its survival depended not on Thomas's discretion alone, which was considerable, but on the indifference or distraction of everyone else, in a house full of people trained, by the very nature of their work, to notice exactly this kind of irregularity. The Duchess, for her part, grew steadily more careless as the weeks went on, the particular carelessness of someone who has never once been caught and has stopped believing she ever will be. She had, after all, spent her entire life inside a system that consistently protected people of her rank from the consequences visited on everyone beneath them. Every earlier transgression in her life, however small, had been absorbed without cost. There was no reason, from where she stood, to expect this one would be any different, and that unshakable confidence, more than cruelty, more than desire, more than boredom, may have been the single trait that ultimately undid her. People who have never been told no rarely develop the instinct to notice when a situation has quietly become dangerous. She walked into the second half of this story with exactly the same unhurried certainty she'd walked into the first half with, entirely unaware that the ground she was standing on had already begun to shift. Below stairs, in the meantime, the ordinary business of the house continued around all of this exactly as it always had. Silver was polished, menus were planned, correspondence was carried up and down staircases by servants trained never to glance too closely at the seals they carried. It is one of the strange, quietly devastating truths about households like this one, that catastrophe and routine could exist side by side, without either one visibly disturbing the other, that a footman could be living through the most dangerous secret of his life, while still standing perfectly still behind a dining chair each evening, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, performing the exact same choreography of invisibility that had defined his entire career in service. The house never stopped running. It simply ran, for a time, with a hidden fracture spreading quietly underneath its floorboards, waiting for the moment someone finally opened the wrong door. Edmund had joined the household more recently than either Thomas or Mary, hired as an under-valet with ambitions considerably larger than his current position. He was sharp, observant, and, unlike Thomas, had not yet learned the specific, hard-won caution that came from years of watching what happened to servants who drew the wrong kind of attention to themselves. Where Thomas had spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, Edmund was still, in many ways, auditioning for a better future, and it made him bolder than was strictly wise in a house like this one. The arrangement held until the night Edmund opened a door he had no reason to expect would be locked, at an hour he had no reason to expect anyone would be awake, and saw something he could not unsee and had no plausible way to explain away. His first instinct, and this too is well documented in accounts of servant life from the period, was fear, the immediate, practical fear of a servant who has just stumbled onto something dangerous above his station. Witnessing something like this put him in an impossible position. Report it, and risk retaliation from a woman with far more power than he had. Say nothing, and become, in effect, complicit in a secret that could destroy his own position the moment anyone discovered he had known, and stayed silent. The Duchess, for her part, did not flinch. She had faced this exact moment once before, and she had a script ready. She looked at Edmund the same unhurried way she had once looked at Thomas, and asked him the only question that had ever mattered inside that house. "What do you want?" It was less a question than an offer, and both of them knew it. She was giving him the same transaction she had built with Thomas: silence purchased with access, discretion purchased with a private arrangement neither of them would ever speak of outside that room. Edmund, younger than Thomas, more ambitious, and considerably less careful, answered in a way she had not planned for. "You," he said, holding her gaze in a way none of her servants had ever quite dared to before. "For one night, the same as him." There was a long pause after he said it, long enough that he must have believed, for a moment, that he'd read the situation correctly, that he had simply discovered the same door Thomas had discovered, and was being offered the same passage through it. "This time," she said no. "That will not be happening," she told him, and there was nothing in her voice now that resembled the careful warmth she had once used with Thomas. This was colder, faster, final. "You will forget what you saw, or you will find yourself unemployed by morning, with a great deal less to show for it than you imagine." It's worth understanding why her calculation flipped so completely between these two moments, because it tells you almost everything about how she thought. Thomas had been useful precisely because he was controllable, a young man deeply in love with someone whose safety she could threaten at will, which gave her total leverage over his silence indefinitely. Edmund offered her nothing comparable. He had no attachment she could threaten, no obvious point of leverage, and a request that, if granted, would only create a second loose thread instead of tightening the one she already controlled. He wasn't an asset to her. He was a liability the moment he opened his mouth. So she refused him, flatly, coldly, the same tone she'd have used to refuse a tradesman quoting too high a price. And Edmund, humiliated, and now, crucially, with absolutely nothing left to lose by talking, walked straight out of that room and went to find the Duke. The Duke was not a man given to raised voices, and it's worth understanding what that actually meant among men of his class in this period, because it wasn't simply a matter of temperament. Aristocratic masculinity, in Regency England, was built around a very particular kind of controlled, deliberate composure. Losing your temper in public, especially over a domestic matter, was itself considered a kind of social failure, a sign that you had lost command of your own household, which for a man of rank was almost as damaging to his reputation as the original scandal itself. Men of the Duke's standing were trained from boyhood to project calm, regardless of what they felt underneath it. So when Edmund finished his account, the Duke did not shout. He listened, and then, with the same unhurried precision his wife had shown toward two different servants in two different rooms, he began quietly confirming it. He questioned Thomas first, alone, in his study, with the door closed. He did not raise his voice once, and that, according to household accounts of masters like him from this period, was almost always more frightening to a servant than shouting would have been. Thomas, given the choice between continuing to protect a secret that had already been discovered and further protecting a woman who had used Mary's safety as leverage against him for months, chose honesty. He confirmed everything, plainly, without embellishment, and without asking for any mercy for himself. He questioned Mary next, separately, and her account matched Thomas's in every detail that mattered, down to the exact bargain the Duchess had offered in that first private conversation. And piece by piece, through what was said and what was carefully not said, the Duke assembled the full shape of what had been happening inside his own household for months, under his own roof, while he remained completely unaware. It's worth understanding, too, that the Duke's decision to pursue criminal conversation damages against his friend was only ever going to be one piece of a much larger, more fragmented legal process. English law of this period split marital disputes across entirely separate court systems that rarely spoke to one another in any coordinated way. Criminal conversation itself was tried in the common law courts, purely as a claim for financial damages. Any formal separation of the couple, if the Duke had wanted one, would have required a completely different proceeding before the ecclesiastical courts, sometimes called Doctors' Commons, which handled matters of marriage and separation under a body of law descended from canon law rather than common law, and full divorce, as already noted, required its own separate Act of Parliament entirely. A wronged husband seeking every possible remedy the system offered might, in theory, have to pursue 3 entirely different legal processes, in 3 entirely different venues, simply to fully address one instance of infidelity, a fragmentation that, in practice, meant most men pursued only the piece of the process that offered them something tangible in return, which very often meant stopping exactly where the Duke stopped, with the damages, and nothing more. His judgment, once it came, was fast and cold. Thomas and Mary were both dismissed within the week, no references, no severance, cast out into a city that offered almost nothing to servants, without a documented history of good conduct behind their names, the exact fate the Duchess had originally threatened Mary with, now arriving anyway, only for an entirely different reason. Whatever the Duchess felt in the days after Thomas and Mary's dismissal is, like so much of her interior life, left to inference rather than record. It is worth considering, though, that a woman who had spent her entire adult life exercising total control over the small world available to her had just watched that control produce nothing but ruin for 2 people who had never had any real choice in the matter to begin with, and that she was, at the very same time, entirely unaware that a second, far older secret of her own was about to be dragged into the same unforgiving light. Whatever satisfaction she may have, once taken in her ability to bend a household to her will, it would have curdled quickly into something closer to dread, as the ground beneath her own feet began, for the first time in the entire story, to shift. Neither of them was permitted to explain the coercion behind what had happened. It would not have mattered if they had. The Duke's grievance, as the law understood it, was not with the specific circumstances that had led his footman into his wife's chambers. Whether by seduction or by threat, made no legal difference whatsoever to the injury done to him. A servant's testimony about being blackmailed into it might have moved a sympathetic listener, but it carried no legal weight at all, and the Duke, in the depth of his own wound, was in no state of mind to extend sympathy to the people who had, however unwillingly, been party to his wife's betrayal. Edmund's own position in the household afterward was, in its own way, precarious as well. A servant who brings a mistress's misconduct to a master's attention performs, technically, a kind of loyalty, but it is a loyalty that unsettles a household rather than steadying it, and masters of this period were not always inclined to reward the messenger as generously as the messenger might have hoped. Whether Edmund was retained, quietly transferred to a less visible position, or simply drifted out of the household himself in the disruption that followed, is, like so much else in this story, lost to the same historical silence that swallowed Thomas and Mary. What we can say with more confidence is that his information was the spark that lit the entire remaining sequence of events, and that he, too, in his own smaller way, discovered exactly how little control a servant actually held over the consequences of a truth he chose to tell. What became of Thomas and Mary afterward is not recorded in any surviving account, which is itself a kind of historical truth worth noting. Servants dismissed without character rarely left any paper trail at all. They simply vanished from the archive the moment they left the house that had employed them. No parish record guaranteed to mention them. No newspaper interested in their fate. Nothing beyond, perhaps, a name crossed off a household ledger. The people with money in stories like this one are the only people history reliably remembers. There's a reason stories like this one still land, 2 centuries later, with an audience that has never lived under coverture and never will. Strip away the powdered wigs and the candlelit corridors, and the underlying shape of it is disturbingly familiar. A person with power over someone's livelihood uses that power to extract something the other person never freely offered, and the legal and social systems built to address it end up protecting reputation and money far more reliably than they protect the people with neither. We like to imagine we've moved entirely past a world where that could happen. The Regency setting makes the imbalance easy to see clearly, precisely because the law wrote it down in such plain, unapologetic language. It is worth asking, every time a story like this resonates, exactly which parts of it we've actually left behind, and which parts simply stopped being written into statute books and started being handled quietly instead. Here is the detail that tells you everything about how this world genuinely functioned beneath its polished surface. The Duke did not sue either of them. Don't mistake this for mercy. It wasn't. The Duke understood the mechanics of criminal conversation law better than he understood, in that moment, his own grief, and the mechanics were brutally simple. A lawsuit for criminal conversation was functionally a claim for damages, and damages require a defendant capable of paying them. Thomas had nothing. He owned no land, held no investments, had no fortune a court could seize, even if the Duke won every argument he made. Suing a penniless footman would have accomplished nothing except dragging the Duke's own private humiliation into a public courtroom for the sole reward of winning a judgment against a man who could never pay it. The scandal would be permanent, the satisfaction would be worthless, so he simply let them go, and as far as the household was concerned, considered the matter closed. It should have ended there. For 3 weeks, it did. It began, by most reconstructions of how these discoveries tended to unfold in this period, with something almost absurdly small. A misplaced letter. A comment made too casually at a card table by someone who assumed the Duke already knew. Aristocratic London was, for all its size, an intensely small world at the top. The same few hundred families, attending the same balls, the same dinners, the same country house parties, season after season, which meant that secrets of this kind rarely stayed contained for long, once more than 1 or 2 people knew them. It is entirely possible the Duke learned of it from a source as unremarkable as an overheard remark he wasn't meant to hear, delivered by someone who had no idea of the damage the sentence would do. Then the Duke learned something that undid every ounce of the composure he had maintained through the entire ordeal with the servants. His closest friend, a man he had known since their school days, hunted with, gambled with, trusted enough to help manage portions of his own affairs, a man who had sat at his own dinner table more times than either of them could count, and had stood beside him, by some accounts, on his wedding day itself, had also been involved with his wife. Not for weeks. For considerably longer than that, as it turned out. Long enough, possibly, to predate everything that had happened with Thomas entirely, which meant the Duke was now forced to reconsider the timeline of his own marriage, wondering how many evenings he had spent believing his wife occupied with correspondence, or with calls to friends, had in fact belonged to someone else the entire time. In the privacy of his own study, before he had said a word to anyone, the Duke was left to sit with a particular and specific kind of grief. Not simply the grief of a wronged husband, which he had already begun, in his own controlled way, to absorb over the preceding weeks, but the far more disorienting grief of realizing that the person he had trusted most completely in the world outside his marriage had been lying to him, comfortably and at length, in every ordinary interaction between them, every hunting trip, every evening at cards. Every piece of advice offered over the management of an estate matter now had to be silently re-examined for what it might have actually concealed. That particular flavor of betrayal, the friend rather than the stranger, the confidant rather than the servant, does not behave like other injuries. It does not simply hurt, it rewrites the past. Friendships among men of the Duke's class were not casual things. They were built through years of shared institutions, the same schools, the same clubs, the same social circuits that determined who could be trusted with a man's reputation, his investments, occasionally his secrets. A betrayal by an outsider was, in some perverse sense, almost expected. The world was full of fortune hunters and opportunists, circling any wealthy household. A betrayal by the one man inside that entire circle, who was supposed to be beyond suspicion, was something else entirely. Here is the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you, because it says more about the era than almost anything else in it. It was not the deeper betrayal that changed the Duke's response. He was honest enough with himself, in the privacy of his own study, to recognize that a footman's involvement with his wife and a trusted friend's involvement with his wife were, morally, the exact same injury, wearing two different sets of clothes. What changed was not the wound. What changed was the paperwork. His friend had money, land, investments, a family name substantial enough to be worth destroying in open court, which meant that, for the first time in this entire sequence of betrayals, a lawsuit was actually worth the Duke's time to file. That is not editorializing. That is, quite literally, how criminal conversation law functioned in practice. Legal historians studying the surviving CrimCon case records from this period have noted the same pattern again and again. The size of the awarded damages tended to track not the depth of the emotional injury, but the financial standing of the defendant and the social rank of the wife involved. Because the entire legal theory rested on treating the wife's fidelity as a kind of property value, the husband was entitled to be compensated for losing. A poor defendant meant a worthless verdict. A wealthy one meant a payday. The law, dressed up in the language of honor and injury, was in practice a very precise instrument for extracting money from men who had enough of it to be worth extracting from. Before any suit could be filed, however, suspicion had to be converted into something a court would accept as evidence, and this, too, was a well-established, almost businesslike part of the process by this point in English legal history. Gentlemen who suspected their wives of infidelity and who intended to pursue criminal conversation damages frequently engaged what were sometimes called common informers or inquiry agents, men hired specifically to watch a household, note comings and goings, question servants discreetly, and assemble precisely the kind of circumstantial evidence a barrister would need to build a convincing case in front of a jury. It was, in effect, an early and unregulated form of private investigation, operating in a legal grey area, with almost none of the oversight such work would eventually be subject to. The Duke, once he had confirmed the essential truth of what he'd learned, would have used exactly this kind of quiet, methodical inquiry to assemble the letters, the servant testimony, and the pattern of circumstantial detail his barristers would eventually lay out in open court. It's worth noting that a lawsuit was not the only avenue of satisfaction available to a wronged gentleman in this period. Dueling, while officially illegal and increasingly frowned upon by the more respectable circles of society, still occasionally settled disputes of exactly this kind between men of rank, particularly earlier in the era. By the time of this story, however, dueling had fallen substantially out of favor among the sort of men who moved in Parliament and polite society. A duel risked criminal prosecution for the survivor, risked the Duke's own life in exchange for a friend's, and, perhaps most persuasively of all, to a man who understood his world as clearly as the Duke did, offered no financial recovery whatsoever, regardless of the outcome. A bullet proved a point, a lawsuit proved a point, and produced a payment. The Duke, whatever grief he carried into that decision, chose the option that would leave him both vindicated and, quite literally, richer for the experience. Word of the coming scandal reached the remaining household staff long before it reached the newspapers. Servants' networks in Georgian and Regency London operated with a speed and reach that often surprised the families who employed them. Footmen, coachmen, and ladies' maids from different households crossed paths constantly, at church, in markets, waiting outside social calls, and gossip about a great family's private troubles could move across an entire neighborhood of townhouses in a matter of days. The remaining staff at Ashworth House would have known, in broad outline, what was coming well before any barrister stood up in court. Some, no doubt, thought of Thomas and Mary as they heard it, of how quickly and completely the ground beneath a servant's feet could shift, and of how little any of them, however careful, however blameless, could ultimately do to protect themselves from a household scandal that had nothing to do with their own conduct at all. The Duke filed his suit within the month, and it became the talk of London before the legal paperwork had even finished being copied out by the clerks. It's worth understanding just how public these trials actually were, because modern readers sometimes assume aristocratic scandals of this period were hushed up and kept quiet. The opposite was often true. Criminal conversation trials were among the most widely attended, widely reported courtroom spectacles of Georgian and Regency England. The public could, and regularly did, pack the galleries to watch. Newspapers reported the proceedings in extraordinary detail, and enterprising printers produced cheap pamphlet transcripts of the most sensational trials, full of private letters read aloud into the court record, servants' testimony about disturbed bedsheets and locked doors, and every intimate detail the plaintiff's lawyers thought would help maximize the damages award, and sold them on street corners for pennies, the true crime tabloid media of their day. A scandal like this one wasn't a secret carefully guarded behind closed doors. It was, quite literally, entertainment sold to strangers who had never met any of the people involved. The courtroom filled the day the trial began, and it stayed full for every session that followed. Tickets to fashionable trials like this one were, in effect, informally traded among London's social circles. Friends of friends securing seats in the public gallery the way they might secure a box at the opera, arriving early enough to watch the barristers arrange their papers before proceedings even began. Outside, hawkers sold broadsheets summarizing the previous day's testimony to anyone who couldn't get a seat inside. Barristers stood and read private letters into the record, word for word, the gallery leaning forward to catch every syllable of correspondence that had never been intended for anyone's eyes but the two people who wrote them. This was, by design, the most devastating weapon available to a plaintiff's counsel in a crim-con trial. Nothing establishes intimacy to a jury quite as effectively as a private letter, and nothing humiliates a defendant quite as thoroughly as hearing his own private words read aloud, syllable by syllable, to a room full of strangers who had paid nothing for the privilege of hearing them. A lady's maid was called to testify about the physical evidence of the affair: disturbed linens, locked doors at unusual hours, the small domestic details that, stitched together, formed the pattern of a long deception. Servants' testimony was, in fact, the backbone of nearly every crim-con case ever tried, because the law required proof, and proof of an affair almost never came from the two people actually involved in it. Plaintiffs' lawyers relied almost entirely on the household staff, who had seen the comings and goings. No one else was positioned to witness. The same servants whose lives were treated as disposable the moment their own conduct came into question, became, in this different context, the single most valuable source of evidence the entire legal system possessed. The Duchess's name was said aloud, over and over, in front of a room full of strangers, stripped of every ounce of the authority and untouchability she had once wielded so completely over the people beneath her in her own household. She was not permitted to sit at counsel's table. She was not called to testify. She was, by every meaningful measure of the trial's structure, absent from her own scandal, present only in the descriptions other people gave of her, in letters other people read aloud, in a story other people were being paid, quite literally, to tell about her. One exchange from the proceedings, reconstructed here from the kind of testimony these trials routinely produced, gives a sense of exactly how clinical the questioning could become. Counsel for the Duke, addressing the lady's maid called to testify, asked her plainly how many mornings she had found the bedchamber door secured from the inside at an hour it was never ordinarily locked. She answered, and the gallery went quiet enough to hear the scratch of the court recorder's pen. Counsel asked her to describe, in as much detail as she could recall, the condition in which she had found the room on those mornings. She answered that too. Nothing about the exchange was framed as an intrusion into anyone's private life. It was framed, throughout, as the establishment of evidence, proof of trespass, offered up in exactly the clipped, procedural language a barrister might use to establish that a fence had been broken or a hedge trampled. That was the peculiar cruelty of the whole proceeding. The most intimate details of another person's life could be extracted, examined, and argued over in open court, provided everyone involved agreed to describe it using the vocabulary of property law rather than the vocabulary of the heart. Transcripts of the trial were being sold on street corners before the week was out, exactly the way contemporary accounts describe such trials being consumed. Total strangers, who had never set foot inside that townhouse, now knew the most intimate details of what had happened behind a locked bedroom door none of them would ever see. This entire commercial ecosystem, cheap pamphlets built around the private ruin of aristocratic marriages, was a genuine and thriving corner of the print trade in Georgian and Regency London. Printers competed to get transcripts to market fastest, sometimes publishing installments before a trial had even concluded, embellishing testimony where the real transcript ran thin on scandal, and trimming it where it ran long on legal procedure nobody wanted to read. These were, in every meaningful sense, the tabloids of their day, and they sold briskly precisely because they offered ordinary readers something rare and irresistible, an unguarded, verified look behind the perfectly composed public face of the aristocracy, proof that the people who seemed to have everything were, underneath it, just as capable of cruelty, foolishness, and heartbreak as anyone else. The appetite for that kind of story has not changed nearly as much in 2 centuries as we sometimes like to believe. The jury that decided the friend's fate would have been composed entirely of men, property-owning men, specifically, since jury service in this period was itself tied to a property qualification, meaning the 12 people deciding how much a betrayed marriage was worth in damages were drawn from precisely the same social stratum as the 2 men actually arguing the case. There was no possibility of a wife, a servant, or anyone without significant property sitting in judgment on a case like this one. The jury's task, as the judge would have instructed them, was not to determine whether love had been real or whether the Duchess bore some share of moral responsibility for what had happened. It was narrower and colder than that, to determine, based on the evidence presented, whether the defendant had in fact interfered with the plaintiff's marital rights, and if so, what sum of money fairly compensated the injury. The friend was found liable. The damages awarded were, by the standards of the day, enormous, the kind of sum that could meaningfully damage even a wealthy family's finances, and would certainly damage what remained of his reputation for the rest of his life. Juries in these cases were instructed to weigh several specific factors when calculating an award: the social rank of the wife, the closeness of the friendship betrayed, the degree of premeditation involved, and quite explicitly, the financial standing of the defendant. A poor man could be found just as liable as a wealthy one, but the practical size of the judgment against him would almost always be smaller, because juries understood, even if the law never said so outright, that there was little point setting a damages figure a defendant had no realistic hope of ever paying. It's worth being precise about what that payment legally represented, because it's the detail that makes this entire case study so revealing. It was not compensation for heartbreak. English law of the period had no real mechanism for compensating emotional injury directly between a husband and the person who wronged him personally. It was, in the strict legal language of the tort, compensation for loss of consortium, for the unauthorized use, as the law quite literally framed it, of another man's property. The friend paid his debt, not to a marriage he had helped destroy, but to a legal category that treated his years-long betrayal of his closest friend as functionally interchangeable with, say, damaging a man's carriage or trespassing on his land. To put the scale of a judgment like this in perspective, surviving records of crim-con verdicts from this general period show damages awarded ranging anywhere from token sums of a few pounds, in cases where a jury clearly doubted the strength of the evidence or sympathized with the defendant, up to sums running into the thousands of pounds in the most sensational cases involving titled families, at a time when a skilled tradesman might earn somewhere in the range of £50 to £100 in an entire year, and a comfortable middle-class household might run on a few £100s annually. A verdict at the higher end of that range, of the kind a case this publicly humiliating would likely have produced, represented not just a financial setback, but potentially the work of a lifetime, converted overnight into a single, devastating line in a courtroom ledger. It's worth being specific about what ruin actually meant for a woman in the Duchess's position, Because it wasn't a figure of speech. A married woman, publicly named in a criminal conversation trial, faced social consequences that had nothing to do with any court's official verdict. Invitations to the events that structured aristocratic life, balls, dinners, the calling visits that maintained a family's standing, would begin quietly drying up, extended instead only by the small number of hostesses willing to risk their own reputation by continuing to receive her. Presentation at court, one of the central rituals confirming a woman's respectability within elite society, would very likely become permanently closed to her. She would not be prosecuted, imprisoned, or formally punished by any instrument of the state. She would simply, gradually, cease to exist within the social world that had defined the entire shape of her adult life, present in the same townhouses, at the edges of the same city, but effectively erased from the only society that had ever recognized her as anyone at all. And the Duchess herself paid nothing. Not because she was found innocent, not because anyone in that courtroom believed for a moment that she bore no responsibility for what had happened. She paid nothing because the law did not permit her to be sued in her own right. She was not a defendant with a case to argue. She had no lawyer standing up to speak on her behalf, no opportunity to explain herself, no legal standing to defend her own reputation in the very courtroom built entirely around the ruin of it. She was, under coverture, treated as the property in dispute rather than a party capable of disputing anything. The asset two men were fighting over the value of, not a person with a side of her own to argue. 3 men touched the Duchess of Ashworth over the course of this story. Only one of them ever answered for it in a court of law. Not the one she trapped through threats against someone he loved. Not the one she refused outright the moment he stopped being useful to her. The one with money. That is the entire system, laid bare inside a single household, over the course of a single scandal. It was never really about a wife's honor, whatever the barristers said out loud in that courtroom. It was never really about a husband's broken heart, whatever the newspapers implied in their breathless coverage. It was about who could pay and who could not, and everyone inside that house, from the Duke down to the lowest kitchen maid, understood that distinction perfectly, long before any lawyer ever stood up to argue it in front of a jury. The friend's life after the verdict tells its own quiet story about how unevenly consequence was distributed, even among the men in this narrative. A damages judgment, however enormous, was a debt that could be managed, restructured, paid down over years through the sale of land or the tightening of a household budget, painful, certainly, and socially damaging, but survivable in a way that total ruin is not. He would likely have withdrawn from London society for a season or two, weathered the whispers at the clubs he still had enough standing to belong to, and eventually, as these things so often went, been permitted back into a version of polite company, once a fresher scandal came along to replace his, in the public imagination. The same social world that had feasted on his humiliation for a single London season had remarkably little appetite for remembering it once the entertainment value had run out. The Duke walked away from the trial with his damages collected and his name, in the strange accounting of London society, still considered clean, a wronged husband who had sought and received satisfaction, exactly as a man of his standing was expected to. His friend walked away financially wounded and socially diminished, but alive, unmarried to anyone, free to eventually rebuild some version of the life he'd had before, in a way none of the other people in this story ever would be. Thomas and Mary walked away with nothing, no references, no severance, no acknowledgement from anyone that either of them had been coerced into anything at all, just each other, and whatever life the two of them could piece together from that point onward, somewhere far outside the world of townhouses and titled names that had so completely controlled the shape of their lives up until the moment it discarded them. And somewhere behind the closed doors of a townhouse in London, in a marriage that would technically continue for the rest of both their lives, because divorce in this period required its own separate, staggeringly expensive Act of Parliament that almost nobody outside the highest ranks of the aristocracy could realistically obtain. A duchess who had once controlled every person beneath her roof, sat utterly ruined in the eyes of the only society she had ever belonged to, while the men around her spent an entire courtroom's worth of hours arguing, in exhaustive public detail, over exactly what she had been worth. It's worth sitting with that final image for a moment, because it's the whole point of this story distilled into a single scene. A woman who spent the entire narrative wielding power over everyone around her, over Thomas, over Mary, over Edmund, over the secret itself, ends the story with no power at all inside the one arena that decided her fate. Not because she lacked intelligence, or will, or nerve. All three of the men in this story, in their own way, feared her, but the law had never actually given her a voice to use. It had given her a role, property, disputed and valued, argued over by men, in a courtroom she wasn't permitted to speak in. This wasn't a quirk of one unlucky household. It was the ordinary machinery of English marriage law, for well over a century after this story would have taken place. Coverture, the legal doctrine that erased a married woman's independent legal identity, remained the governing framework of English marriage until a long, slow sequence of reforms in the second half of the 19th century finally began to dismantle it. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 being among the most significant, finally allowing married women in England to own and control property in their own names for the first time in generations. Criminal conversation as a cause of action was eventually abolished in England in 1857, replaced by a divorce process that, while still deeply unequal by modern standards, at least allowed a wife to be recognized as something closer to a party in her own marital dispute rather than simply the disputed property itself. Until then, stories exactly like this one, a wife blamed, a lover sued, a servant destroyed for being caught in the middle of it, and a husband walking away with his name and his damages intact, played out again and again inside the grand houses of Regency London, largely invisible to history except in the surviving court records and the cheap printed pamphlets that turned other people's ruin into an afternoon's entertainment for total strangers. It's also worth remembering that the people most thoroughly erased from this story are not the ones whose names survived in any court record at all. We know, in outline, what happened to dukes and their friends because their fortunes were large enough to leave a paper trail, deeds, settlements, damages judgments, printed pamphlets sold under their names. We know almost nothing by comparison about the countless Thomases and Marys who passed through households like this one, whose entire experience of these scandals was to be used, blamed, and discarded, with no one troubling to record where they went afterward or what became of them. If there is a single thread worth pulling out of this story and holding on to, it might be this. The people with the least power in this narrative were the only ones who behaved with anything resembling real integrity under pressure. Thomas refusing, before he had any leverage to refuse from, and later, choosing honesty with the Duke, even knowing it would cost him everything. The people with the most power spent the entire story calculating exactly how much cruelty they could extract from everyone beneath them before it became too costly to continue. The Duchess of Ashworth was never a real woman, but everything that happened to her in this story was, in its structure, entirely real, assembled from the actual legal mechanics, the actual social codes, and the actual devastating imbalance of power that defined marriage, servitude, and womanhood in this era. Somewhere in the surviving legal archive of Georgian and Regency England, there are real transcripts of real criminal conversation trials that read almost exactly like the fictional one you just heard. Real letters, read aloud to strangers. Real servants, testifying about disturbed bedsheets. Real damages calculated not by the depth of anyone's pain, but by the size of a defendant's bank account. The costume dramas give you the ballrooms, the calling cards, the perfectly tailored coats, and the witty drawing room banter. What they leave out, almost always, is this: the quiet, brutal legal machinery running underneath all of it, deciding, long before anyone ever stepped into a courtroom, whose pain was going to count as an injury worth paying for, and whose pain was simply going to be the cost of being poor, or being a woman, or both. It's also worth understanding what didn't change for the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth after the trial ended, because that, too, tells you something the tidy version of history usually leaves out. Divorce, as we think of it today, was not a realistic option for either of them. Obtaining a full divorce in England during this period required an individual Act of Parliament, a private bill, debated and voted on by the House of Lords, that could take years and cost a sum of money so enormous it was, in practical terms, available only to the wealthiest handful of families in the entire country, and even then, almost exclusively to husbands, since a wife seeking to divorce her husband on grounds of his own infidelity had to clear an even higher bar, proving aggravating circumstances beyond adultery alone. For nearly everyone else, including families as wealthy as the Ashworths, marriage was permanent, regardless of what happened inside it. The Duke and Duchess, having just spent a season's worth of London gossip consumed entirely by the public unraveling of their marriage, would in all likelihood have continued living under the same roof, attending the same social events, hosting the same dinners, for the rest of both their lives, bound together by a legal institution that offered financial remedy for betrayal, but no actual exit from it. That single fact recontextualizes almost everything else in this story. The trial wasn't a resolution. It wasn't an ending, in the way a modern divorce proceeding might function as an ending. It was a public accounting, a moment where the law allowed the Duke to extract a specific, quantifiable measure of satisfaction from one of the men who had wronged him, without in any way freeing him, or his wife, from the marriage that had produced the wound in the first place. Both of them walked out of that courtroom still married to each other, in a society that would spend years, quite possibly the rest of their lives, quietly referencing the scandal every time either of their names came up in a drawing room. If this story pulled you in, it's worth remembering that it isn't really about one household, one duchess, or one trial. It's about an entire legal architecture that shaped the private lives of millions of people for generations, one where love, betrayal, and power were never actually private at all. They were property questions, waiting for the right courtroom and the right amount of money to finally be argued out loud. All right, here's a quick question. Do you think this dynamic, power protecting power, and the poor paying for it, still plays out today, just without the wigs and courtrooms? Also, before you answer the question, if this story kept you listening past the point you meant to stop, please consider subscribing. It's the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you too. Thank you.